Just tell us your name and where you grew up in this area around here in the rivers.
My name's Steve Shaffer. I grew up in Ironton, Ohio, on the banks of the Ohio River.
So how did you become interested in the local histories of the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio River?
You know, the older I get, I think you're born with this love of history or this fascination for history. I remember as a kid, my dad was an insurance agent. A lot of people came in to see him, and I remember one of his clients brought in a box of arrowheads one time. He picked out of his garden, and Dad called me over and said, "Hey, look at these." And I had no idea there were Indians in this area. I thought Indians were on the Great Plains and they wore headdresses, such as you saw in Hollywood at that time. So I think that ignited my interest in history and prehistory.
So when was the first time you heard about Indian Head Rock?
I was in the 6th grade at Central School, and I had a good buddy, Terry Reedy. We were interested in Indians, and somehow we came across a book called Stories Old and Often Told in the school library. And it was written by Henry Bannon back in the 20s, and it talked, just had all kinds of great stuff about regional history and flora and fauna. But it had this great story about how he and his brother had taken this picture in 1920 of the Indian's Head Rock and how no one had seen it since then, and how he thought it would never be seen again.
So did that, when you were a kid, just interest you to think about the rock and kind of where it was at? And
I wondered if that rock was still on the bottom of the river, and we were, my dad and I were involved in an amateur archaeology group, and we went to a lot of meetings, and we went to different sites to see mounds and different things, and I thought, man, this, if it's still there, you know, maybe someday somebody will find it.
Talk a little bit about some of the histories of the rock. You told the stories old and often told. I read that there was a touring circus promoter who also used images of the rock. What's some of those histories?
There are stories about this rock that date back to the 1840s that were published. Squire and Davis that wrote an important early archaeological tome called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And they mentioned the rock, and they described it as a colossal human head, which it was not. But like so many people that talked about this rock, they never saw it. But they added to the folklore, and others followed suit. There was a creator of a panorama, and I don't know if you know, a panorama is sort of a predecessor of TV. It was a manually controlled show, which if you think about paper towels, there was 2 wooden rolls with the canvas scenes painted on them, and they were turned, and they were really, really fascinating, and the public enjoyed them. And they toured all over the United States and even Europe. And this one panorama, they decided needed the Indian's Head Rock. So his artist, Dickinson's artist, painted this unbelievably fantastic human head sticking out of the Ohio River. So that contributed to the myth and the folklore about the rock.
So I looked up some of the pictures. If you kind of Google search the name, one of the first pictures you see is a young lady standing on the rock. Did you guys ever figure out who she was?
You know, the young lady that's standing on that iconic photograph of the rock, the only thing that I've heard to date was that there was a family in Portsmouth by the name of Selby, and they were very prosperous people. They owned shoe factories in Portsmouth and also in Ironton, and they had daughters. And when there was one of the daughters passed away, and this photograph was found in her possession. So there was some speculation, maybe this is a photograph of one of the Selby girls. And I hope someday somebody, some sleuth will figure out who that young lady is.
Do you think she rode out on a boat and got on?
Oh, I'm sure she rode out on a boat. And if you look at her dress, it's just immaculate. You look at her hat, it's got the Indian feathers in it. So yeah, this was a real photo op when the rock was out of the water.
So who was Bannon, and what role did Bannon have in documenting the rock, especially in those photographs?
Henry Bannon and his two brothers were Portsmouth movers and shakers. They were attorneys, business people, historians. Henry went to Congress for a session, I think. But they're probably most noted for saving and recording the history of Scioto County. And Henry wrote two books, Stories Old and Often Told, and Scioto Sketches, which is just a great resource for local history. And it was, I think it was in October of 1920, there were pictures of the rock and people standing on the rock, but nobody had taken a picture of the Indian's face. And Arthur Bannon decided, hey, we need to do this. And an opportunity arose. There was already a wicket dam below Portsmouth, a wooden dam, and it was late in the year, so the water level was low. Well, a steamboat hit the dam at night, knocked a hole in it, and really dropped the river level to low enough point that the rock was sticking out, but the face wasn't out of the water. So they had like a day to get this picture as they're working on the dam, and they have a small motorboat, and Arthur comes up with a plan. He says, listen, here's what we'll do. He says, you stand in the water with the camera. I'm going to drive this boat around the rock, and when the wake pulls the water away, you snap the picture. And by golly, they did it. And they got the only known photograph of the actual face on the rock. That was in October of 1920. And Henry Bannon says in his story about that, he goes, and as we watch the rock sink beneath the water, this is probably the last time this rock will ever be seen again.
So who carved the face on the rock?
Well, it depends on who you ask. There's a story that a quarryman carved it, which, you know, they did quarry a lot of rocks on that hillside. There's a story that an Indian carved it, and that's the most romantic story, and I like that story. The Bannons believed that was the fact, and I've tracked after them somewhat. There's a story riverboat pirates carved it to mark some of their ill-gotten gain, which was stashed nearby. And there's a story that little Johnny Book carved it. And little Johnny Book went off to the Battle of Shiloh and got himself killed. And he is a true historical figure. So those are some of the stories of where that face originated.
I think it's funny the type of face that it is. It's rounded. It looks very much like Charlie Brown in the modern age.
It does. It's very simple. I believe some young boys carved it. Maybe stole a chisel out of their dad's toolbox, because it's very crude. And I think one thing that I've noticed, that if you look under the face, there are a number of lines just carved, and I think those are water levels. And I think that every year when that rock popped up, somebody would carve a line. So the rock was so much, the water level was so much above the face or below the face. And I think it was just a local watermark.
Now, I've read several references to the rock being known as the Portsmouth Indian Head Rock. So is the rock more of a historical Portsmouth item or Greenup, Kentucky, or South Shore, Kentucky?
Well, that answer is geological and geographical. On the Kentucky side is a steep, rocky hillside. There were very few houses over there. On the northern side is a broad alluvial plain where the city of Portsmouth thrived. And there just wasn't a population base on the Kentucky side. It's that simple. All the people that had a connection, or most of the vast majority of people that had a connection to that rock, lived on the Ohio side of the river.
And I've seen it written that way in history as the Portsmouth Indian Head Rock.
That's how everyone always referred to that. And I guess if you go to the Portsmouth Library, you'll find all these magazine articles and pictures, newspaper articles, postcards. And we hoped when we got the rock out that we would see something come out of Kentucky, but there was just nothing there. There was just absolutely no documentation. There's one piece, Collins' History of Kentucky, and if you compare it with a 1854 Portsmouth Times newspaper article, they had just copied that information into that history book.
Yeah. When you were a kid, did you ever ride up and down the river hoping to be around?
No, I didn't have a boat when I was a kid,
Okay.
so yeah.
So when you got interested in trying to find the rock, where did you start to try to figure out where it was at? Did you go back and read histories or old timers who had still been around who might have known?
When we decided to look for the rock, and Bob Maslowski was a big help, Corps Engineers archaeologist, we took all the available clues. Henry Bannon had a number of clues in his book, plus the newspaper articles. One was if you stood on Bond Street and you looked out toward the river, that's where the rock was. Well, the college is built on top of Bond Street now, so that view wasn't really accessible, although we did get on top of the college and look. But we narrowed down an area of several hundred yards, and we had learned that obviously the river had risen since the construction of the dams. So when we started looking for this rock, we were looking for it in 20 feet of water plus, thinking the river had come up that much. Well, that, you know, there's an old saying that goes, you build your box and you work inside of it. We had ignored everything at any lesser depth. And we probably swam over, boated over that rock dozens of times. And we were just looking in the wrong place for almost 3 years.
So walk us through the process of when you located the rock. Did you just kind of have a pretty good idea through sonar or the other technology you were using that was it? Did you find other similar rocks before you knew you found Indian head rock?
I didn't scuba dive at that time, but I had talked to Bob Maslowski at the Corps Engineers, and we thought, well, maybe we can attract some local divers. So we went to a dive shop in Huntington, West Virginia, and all the divers that found the rock are all West Virginia fellas. So it was a group area effort. And they were more than happy to come down. We showed them all our information, and we set up more or less a grid and started searching this area. And at the time, I didn't dive because I've got hearing issues. And that was the toughest 2 years of my life, to sit in that boat and watch those guys go down there and then come back and talk about it. And the third year, I went ahead and got certified. I wasn't going to sit in the boat anymore. And as I said, we had searched and searched, and we couldn't find that thing. And just by perchance, a couple of the divers were swimming in toward the bank and ran into it in 16 feet of water. And there it was, just beautifully preserved.
Wow. So talk about how, after you found it, you got it up out of there, because that had to be a heck of a process. We found it in 2002, and absolutely no one was interested. You know, the people in Kentucky, the people in Ohio, there was just no interest in it. Bob Maslowski retired from the Corps Engineers. He was interested, but it was, you know, new people came in and they weren't interested. So it just the rock went to sleep again. And then in 2005, I started looking in the river again for other petroglyphs. There are a number of other inundated petroglyph sites, Native American and otherwise, all up and down the Ohio River and the tributaries. And I contacted some divers at a dive shop in Portsmouth and asked them if they would be interested in looking for some of these. And we took a pontoon boat and we were headed upstream. And I asked these fellows, I said, you guys ever hear of the Portsmouth Indian's Head Rock? No. I said, well, come on, we'll dive on that and I'll show it to you. And they were just astounded. They'd never seen it, never heard of it. And wow, look at those names. And they were Portsmouth names, recognizable Portsmouth names. And one Dean Dixon asked me, he said, you ever think about getting this out? And I said, Dean, this would take a lot of money and a lot of equipment. You need a barge, you need cranes. And he goes, no. He goes, I think you can get this out with air. I said, what? He said, with air. He goes, I've gotten cars. He was a search and rescue diver. He said, I've gotten cars off the bottom of the river with nothing but air. I said, man, this is a lot bigger than a car. I said, this is big, and we don't know if it's attached to the bottom of the river. He goes, no. He says, yeah, I'd like to try it if you'd like to. So we decided we'd try it, and we came back and we had airbags and all these canisters of air, and we spent all one day rigging up a harness and hooking all this stuff up. We filled all those bags up, and that rock didn't budge. It just sat there. And I said, well, you gave it a great try, guys. Well, Dean Dixon, he's not a quitter.
And he said, "It's math, Shaffer, math." I said, "How do you get that?" He says, "We need more air." So he got these big blue barrels you see around marinas. We came back the next weekend, hooked all those up. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was on the boat running the air tanks, filling the air tanks up. And I was hungry and I wanted to go home. And all on site, they had this great communication system where they could talk to each other on headsets, and I could hear them underwater. And once I heard that thing crackle, and somebody said, "This rock's wiggling." And one of the other divers said, "What?" He said, "This rock's wiggling. Get out of the way." And all once that rock lifted right off the bottom and just hung there in midair. And we were just elated and astounded, and, you know, well, we got it. Now what do we do with it? We had absolutely no plan. You know, we were just trying to see if we could raise it. So we tried to go upriver with it, and it was too heavy. So we went downriver with it, and we decided we're gonna lower it in more than 10 feet of water, close to the Portsmouth landing, and that way we could find somebody to lift it out. And that's what we did. And about a week and a half later, somebody knew somebody that worked for a crane company, and he came out and lifted it out of the river. He did a beautiful job and put it on a trailer, and we covered it. And that Monday morning, I think we were in the mayor's office, and we gave it to the mayor of Portsmouth for the people to enjoy.
Mayor Jim Cobb?
Mayor Jim Cobb.
He's still the mayor, right?
Mayor, is he still the mayor?
I can't remember.
I can't remember either. He might be.
Randy Nichols, I thought, told me he was still the mayor. I can't remember. Okay, let's see. So when you guys got the rock and you had it and you gave it to the city of Portsmouth, where did you think it should go? Do you think it should go maybe in the Welcome Center? Should it be like by the flood walls? Where did you think it should have went, the rock?
Well, we thought it should be displayed in an appropriate manner. As far as location, we thought it should be displayed in Portsmouth. And there had been some discussion with the Portsmouth authorities through the Corps engineers that they knew Portsmouth was interested in getting this rock, and there had been nothing said against it. And so we thought, you know, this would be the perfect home for it because all the history's around it. Mayor Cobb, in his wisdom, the first thing he did was contact the South Shore authorities, which was the closest town on the Kentucky side, and talked to their mayor and said, "Hey, why don't you come over and look at this? These guys found this rock. It's got a bunch of Portsmouth names on it." And the mayor came over and was very gracious, said, "You know, you can display it. We don't know what we'd do with it." And so Jim did recognize that, you know, that most of the river does belong to Kentucky. That wasn't an issue, or we didn't see it as an issue at that point.
Yeah, South Shore seemed kind of reluctant and all at that time. Okay, so let's see. So when did all of you got it out of the water, the excitement, Portsmouth newspaper did a story on it, and Frank at the Portsmouth newspaper claims he was the first person to actually do a news story on this. From that point, when did it start to become this big media issue that the other media people got involved with it, and then it became a legal issue?
The reporting on the recovery was really bad. You know, we had a fact sheet and we sent it out. One newspaper told us this isn't even newsworthy, and they came back later and decided it was. But nobody used our fact sheet or was interested in it. Everybody wanted to do their own thing, but unfortunately, they just wanted to just create some kind of media frenzy, and there wasn't any focus on the facts or what actually happened or what the rock actually represented.
So at what point did Kentucky get involved?
You know, we called Kentucky very soon after it came out. Different people, you know, different offices, different archaeologists, and let them know, invited them down to come and see it. And they were strangely quiet, and I don't think anybody came to see it till November. And we got it out in September.
So very quickly after that, the state politicians of Kentucky got involved. Of course, Reginald Meeks past the resolution, and the rest is history, how the trial and stuff went. But did it initially shock you when Kentucky was so upset?
Yeah, I was absolutely flabbergasted because they wanted to put this rock back in the river. And some even suggested it needed to be destroyed. And we laughed at first. We thought it was so outrageous. But we found out soon enough they were serious. They did want to put this thing back in the river.
Did the mayor, Jim Cobb at the time, or current mayor, whichever, did the South Shore people kind of that denied it first to have the rock, did they seem interested after that again? Like after Kentucky sort of made an issue of it?
No, I know. And that's a good question for Jim Cobb. I never heard anything else after that regarding South Shore. That's a good question.
That's where Bobby Carpenter told us that he has tried for the last few years to get something over there, and they just don't have the money. That's what he says. They just don't have the money and the funds to make it happen. And that's what he said about Greenbow Park too. They didn't have the money nor the funds to make it happen, and the state doesn't want to give any money to the state parks.
Right.
Well, does it? How did the rock end up in Greenup, Kentucky, in a barn garage?
Well, of course, they filed criminal charges against us. First, it was antiquities theft, and that didn't apply to any of their laws, what we did. And they finally dropped that, and they charged us with receiving stolen property. And I'm not sure where that came from, but somebody was going to pay for this thing. And so this drug on for 2.5 years, and it never did go to trial. It was just a sad situation, and nobody seemed to want to put a stop to it. And finally, right before my criminal trial date, they just dropped the whole thing.
And then they give the rock to Greenup?
Okay, that was a criminal trial. About the time the criminal trial wrapped up, they charged us with a civil offense. Myself, Dave Vetter, my dive buddy, the city of Portsmouth. Well, this is a whole different ball of wax. This is in federal court in Ashland. And I think they wanted $90,000. They wanted us to pay for the transportation of the rock, and they wanted the rock. And we got over into this courtroom, and this was a federal judge, and he was appointed. He's not elected, and he's the boss. He is the boss. So he looks down at all these attorneys for Kentucky and our attorneys, and he says, "Gentlemen, I don't want this rock in my courtroom. There's a room over there. Figure out how to get it out." So we went in this room, and it didn't take long at all. The Portsmouth solicitor told me, "Steve, you spent a lot of money on this rock. We spent a lot of money on this rock. Let's just give it to them and make them take care of it." And I said, "Fine, that's all we wanted in the first place, was a guarantee that it wasn't going to go back in the river." So they dropped the $90,000, they dropped the transportation costs, and we gave them the rock. So this you'll hear that this went to trial, and a judge determined that this rock belonged. No, it never did go to trial in either case. It was just settled.
The rock's resting place currently is in a city garage that they store equipment in what looked to be salt. And they built a wall out of a blue tarp. And then the rock itself is covered by a tarp. The door to the rock, where the rock is located, is propped up by a cinder block broken in half is what keeps it shut. Does it sadden you after all of the research you did and the elation and the history behind finding the rock, that this is where the rock rests now?
Well, I liken where the rock rests now as to being back in the water. I mean, it's in oblivion. It's not on display. It's not protected. It's just in a shed. But hopefully, maybe some new people will rethink this thing, and we really hope this rock has a happy ending.
Well, there's a lot of people out there who would find this rock interesting and didn't know anything about it beforehand. And then people like you, historians of the region,